So there's a weird dynamic underway where the media doesn't have a great grasp of how to cover Joe Biden, bizarrely enough. And you'd think that it would be instinctually easy for them to cover a candidate like Biden, given how ubiquitous in national politics he has been for several decades. But they don't quite know how to properly characterize it, meaning his support. And one way to think about it is I think that the reasons for Biden's support are pretty glaringly obvious. Like they don't require a whole lot of intensive interrogation. It's not like when a candidate bursts onto the scene, such as a Trump or a Bernie in 2016, you have to make some effort to try to understand why they've gained the traction that they had, right? It wasn't obvious to the pundit class why a Bernie or a Trump would have surged in the way that they did. But with Biden, it's just kind of a carryover effect of these long-standing, almost self-evident trends, and therefore doesn't lend itself to any kind of interesting narrative, really. So there does seem to be a pervasive sense of almost denial that Biden is as strong as he is. But at this point, the polling, I'm sorry to say, does become somewhat predictive of the ultimate outcome. For example, in 2007, 2008, Obama paid a lot of attention to Iowa. He knew that he had to get a good showing in Iowa in order to overtake Hillary Clinton nationally. And so if you can go look at polls from this point in the 2008 cycle, August of 2007, and find that there were polls in which Obama was polling in the mid-20s. And then his ultimate victory in Iowa was in the low to mid-30s. So there was a good reason to believe, even several months before, that Obama was well positioned to win Iowa. So, which is all just to say that it's foolish to just summarily discount the significance of polling now. On the other hand, do you have to look at it all with a grain of salt and through a skeptical lens? Yes. Are there problems with the way in which polls get portrayed and kind of manipulated in media narratives? Sure. But it doesn't mean that kind of a nihilistic attitude toward the entirety of data, like of statistical analysis, is warranted. Trump was leading in the polls at this point in the 2016 cycle, especially nationally, and the media, including myself to a degree at that time, worked themselves into knots to explain away why Trump's poll lead didn't mean anything at that point. So here's probably the most important poll that's come out in several weeks. Came out today. Monmouth is among the most reliable pollsters, probably not perfect, whatever, but has a good track record relative to other pollsters. And they find that Biden's support in Iowa has actually increased marginally since the last time they polled Iowa, which was in April, just before Biden announced. So Biden is now at 28% in Iowa, the first caucus state, according to Monmouth, followed by Warren at 19, Harris at 11, Sanders at 9. Now, it's a little bit of an ominous sign for Bernie, I have to say, because he has gone down by 7 points since the last time Monmouth polled Iowa. Now, in thinking about Bernie's polling results, I think a useful heuristic is to just assume that his organizational and activist advantage bolsters him a little more in the polling data than that bolsters him more than the polling data necessarily shows. So I would kind of like just manually insert an almost like 2 or 3% bump onto Bernie's numbers, um, especially in a caucus state, which privileges organization, right? So if you have the most organized, quote, ground game in Iowa by far, then that might not show up in polls as an advantage to the extent that would be justified. So just kind of as a mental uh, addition, I would tack on a couple points to whatever Bernie's total is in Iowa. But that doesn't detract from the fact that Biden is still in a somewhat commanding lead in Iowa, according to the most reliable pollster. And what else does that tell us? Well, it shows that the attacks on Biden have not been successful. What was it initially? Remember when he first announced there was a whole spate of stories about how he was touchy-grabby, or that he was like low-key Me Too'd? That had no impact, except among professional class Twitter denizens who were unbelievably outraged that, Uncle Joe said this or that to some little girl or whatever. It was just, I think that there are so many legitimate criticisms of Biden. And yet the irony is that the criticisms that have been most amplified by the media and by Biden's rival candidates have been among the least effective criticisms. So in June into July, the whole narrative was that Biden was, if not overtly racist, tacitly racist. And it's just like, do you know why Joe Biden is in the position that he's in now? I mean, again, it's almost too glaringly obvious to mention, but because it's so obvious, it seems to fly over the heads of people. Because he was the vice president for the first black president. I mean, hello. So the idea that you're going to meaningfully undercut his support, especially among black voters, by pointing to a 45-year-old issue having to do with busing, does anybody think, why did anybody think that that would actually be effective? I didn't. I said it at the time. And sure enough, Biden's support hasn't budged, especially in the southern states, which have large black electorates. So here's a poll from North Carolina that also came out in the past 24 hours or so. Now, North Carolina is a Super Tuesday state, so it's not quite as important as South Carolina, but nonetheless, it's illustrative. And this is also a credible pollster, Survey USA. Biden's got 57% support among black voters in North Carolina. 57. That's by far more than any of his competitors combined. Okay? So if you're a reasonable person, I would think at this point you would have to conclude, or you would have no choice but to conclude, that the racially based attacks on Biden have just not been effective because they weren't really substantive. They were more performative. And number two, it's not going to move people who are drawn to Biden on account of his association with the first black president. I know sounds incredibly obvious, but it seems to be lost on a lot of people. And Dennis Kucinich made exactly this point when I spoke to him for the podcast last week, which you can go back and listen to. So now what? Well, I don't know. I mean, nothing has worked really on Biden so far. So what I think you would have to bet on is that although that Biden doesn't have enough of a motivated core of support among highly engaged people and younger people for him to do well in Iowa. And therefore, maybe his numbers are slightly inflated to the point where somebody else could win Iowa, whether a Warren or a Bernie, etc. But that's no guarantee. I mean, people found all kinds of ways to rationalize why the polls weren't going to be predictive of the outcome in 2016 in the primaries, especially among Republicans, and that kind of blew up in everybody's face because Trump was consistently the leader in the polls since from July of 2015 onward. And we're at a point now where Biden's lead hasn't really budged since in a number of months, despite the onslaught of attacks and the failed tactics to undermine him. Now, there is one potential means by which Biden truly could be undermined, and it's more a result of his own cognitive abilities than anything else. Now, if you watch a Biden speech, I can understand what he's saying. He's not totally deficient in terms of his communicative abilities. He can speak in English, but I think anybody would have to conclude that he's lost a lot of his acuity compared to the relatively recent past. I've been watching old debates from 2007 and 2008, and there are times when Biden kind of flubs a word or stumbles over a sentence phrasing or whatever, but it was never to the degree that you just thought that he was incoherent. Where there are times now where he's 76, going on 77 years old, where it just seems incredibly clear that he's losing his marbles to an extent. Now, everybody messes up when they're extemporaneously speaking at times. I do it. Everybody does it. Okay, so that's not the issue. The issue is that it's so recurrent on Biden's part that it does raise serious questions about whether he is cognitively equipped, not just to manage the presidency, right, which is a mind-bogglingly massive endeavor, to beat Trump. So if I were another candidate right now and I thought that Biden was my chief competitor, I would be forgetting about the racial stuff because that's not going to help me make any inroads with blacks. It's just not going to happen, given the historic role that Biden played in elevating and supporting the first black president. Not going to happen. Okay. Forget about the Me Too stuff, which I know a lot of people online like, including some right wingers who wanted to make a bad faith fuss over the Biden hugging girls or whatever. Stupid. People don't buy it. I never bought it. Make sure people understand that the core argument of Biden's campaign at the moment, that he's somehow the most electable and the safest choice to restore honor to the country and defeat Trump, is built upon a mountain of lies, right? Because he's not altogether enough mentally to do it. He can't pull off the task. Just watch him. I spoke to him in South Carolina in June. And again, I can comprehend the point that he was making, but the way in which he articulated the point leads you to believe, rightly, I would think, that he's just not. He's undergoing something that people in their late 70s often undergo, which is that they're not as adroit as they were 20 or 30 years prior, or even 10. So if Biden appears to be teetering on the verge of senility, that would be something to emphasize as to his liabilities for being the most competent person to take on Trump. We know Trump's going to talk about it. Trump's pretty darn old himself. He was the oldest president ever elected. And if he were to win a second term, he'd be well into his upper 70s. But Trump just doesn't come across as wavering cognitively, at least in the way that Biden does. Now, Trump's brain is addled for other reasons. but I don't know that it's necessarily as a function of age, although you actually could make an argument that there is some age-related decline. But with Biden, it's just so much more apparent. And so at a certain point, I do think that's going to be raised more forcefully by maybe not the other candidates themselves, but their surrogates and their supporters. Because I just don't believe that Biden is a safe choice against Trump. Maybe he'll win, whatever, but the guy is not mentally all there at this point. Doesn't mean that you're a bad person if you're aging. It just means that you ought not to be the nominee of your party, right? But the media coverage of Biden just confuses me. It's not exciting that he's got this level of support among black voters. It's not a novel narrative for him to be trudging along with a consistent, 30% or so level of support. So the media concocts all these kind of extraneous sub narratives that don't actually give you a great insight into what's going on. But I think if his lead persists, which it's likely to do, you're going to see more direct talk as to whether he's got the mental juice to actually withstand the onslaughts that are going to be inevitably raining down on him from Donald Trump. All right. I'm going to be doing another live stream later on this afternoon with a special guest. Part of why I'm doing this as a live stream now is just to test that this new software called StreamYard works, because YouTube just discontinued Google Hangouts as an option for live streaming on YouTube with multiple people. So I just wanted to make sure that it works, and it seems to work. So it's actually a good service. So I would recommend it. Not going to tell you the guest yet. You'll have to wait just a couple hours, but I think you'll enjoy it. All right, I'll see you in a little bit.